Murat of The Athletic is with us. He's got his latest piece in The Athletic is on Andrew Copp's situation with the Winnipeg Jets. And Murat, to me, this is one of many big stories around the Winnipeg Jets, but one that I would imagine behind the scenes, there's plenty of discussions taking place right now because of how important his situation is, the important player he is, the asset that he is, and of course, going forward. Let's start off with this. If you're Andrew Copp and you're Kurt Overhart, how are you approaching this negotiation going into potentially a one-year deal and unrestricted free agency in 12 months?
I think I'm approaching it, if I'm Andrew Copp, with a tremendous amount of confidence. I think that what he's been able to do, play in a top 6 minutes situation for 2 years, and to deliver with top 6 point production, especially this season. I know there were spurts in the past, but this was the real one where it was the story from start to finish, especially with that Ehlers and Stastny line. He has the numbers, and players get paid for points and ice time. I think he has those in all 3 states of the game, 5-on-5 PK, played on the power play too. And because he's a restricted free agent with arbitration rights a year away from UFA status, for me, this is the most cards that an RFA will ever hold in his corner. Career year, 58-point pace, arbitration, if he elects for it and goes through that hearing, it's going to be a one-year deal, right to unrestricted free agency. Winnipeg doesn't want to lose him for nothing. Andrew Copp knows Winnipeg doesn't want to lose him for nothing. So when that first long-term contract offer arrives this month, and it will, I'm sure, Andrew Copp gets to look at it and say, I don't have to say yes to the first thing that you put in front of me. I've become an important part of this team, production-wise, leadership-wise, etc. And if you don't give me what I want, well, I'll be an unrestricted free agent in a year, and I believe I can score 50 points again. Perhaps that would be the belief if you're Andrew Copp.
Yeah, well, and there's 2 sides to it because, excuse me, as you mentioned, he's coming off a career year. I don't think that it would be a better time to sign any contract than when you have sort of, pushed to another level offensively, which, as you mentioned, is often the metric that really does get guys paid in this league. Other side of it is that, the timing is great to do that. If you don't do it right now, there's so much on the line in a final year going into unrestricted free agency, regardless of what that may mean for where you actually play this year. Pushing it off 1 year means you really do need to do it again.
Oh, let me think. So I want to think through that. I had not considered that line. But if you're Andrew Copp and you just scored 58 at a 58-point pace, pardon me, and there's any chance in the world you're not going to do it again, how much money do you leave on the table by becoming the third line left wing again, not necessarily being pushed up the lineup, scoring 30 points or something to that effect? Do you leave money on the table? Are you Patrick Laine this year, leaving Paul Stastny and Nick Ehlers or Kyle Connor, whoever he was going to play with, not having a huge year, and look at all the money he left on the table? Sometimes when you bet on yourself, it doesn't work out. Sometimes the house wins that situation. I guess that's the point you're making. Hey, do I have that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, he's sort of bet on himself through the arbitration, and he's got to this point. Then I guess there is an argument that if there was ever a time to sign a long-term deal, right now could be that time for Andrew Copp. And if you don't do it, there is an inherent risk in going back into it and having to do it again and going through this again, albeit as an unrestricted free agent to the highest bidder.
Yeah, if you're Andrew Copp and you're not comfortable with that kind of risk, then I say that you probably lean towards that long-term contract as soon as possible. For me, my sense of Andrew Copp is he's worked specifically towards giving himself this opportunity. I mean, after last arbitration, he and I got a chance to talk, and he was talking about how important that sort of process was for him because he had worked for a decade to become a professional hockey player. This is a short window of income potential for these guys. And all these sorts of things. So I interpret him to be, not saying this is his perspective, somebody who believes in himself very much, who believes in his CBA given rights to maximize things as much as possible. And if I am him and I'm sort of reading the tea leaves of Winnipeg's roster moving forward into this season, if there's any chance Paul Stastny isn't going to be back, and we obviously don't know what his future is quite yet, I see an opportunity for myself to step forward into a bigger role once again. And I think that there are holes that he could step into and maybe convince himself and believe that there's a continued offensive production and therefore even more money. Because I think back to JT Miller, and I used him as a trade comparable for Andrew Copp. because he was traded at the draft in 2019 for a first and a third, Tampa to Vancouver. I thought he was the outer bar, not because he was better than Copp, but because he had done it for about 2-3 seasons at that stage. And I think that's how a player establishes his value, is not just doing it once, doing it another time.
Yeah, and I have no doubt that the Winnipeg Jets know how important Andrew Copp is. I mean, last year was a perfect example. I mean, he really, was the utility knife of the lineup. I mean, he played in all of the top three lines. I mean, was a significant contributor in special teams on both sides, on the power play and from the and killing penalties. So, I mean, the value to the Jets certainly is there. And then you add in the points. I mean, it's going to take a significant, commitment by Winnipeg to get him signed long term. You mentioned arbitration. You spoke. I'll never forget the conversation we had on the program with Andrew Copp after the arbitration. And I've always respected him. I mean, he's a straight shooter. I mean, there's not a lot of BS from Copp. And listen, that process is not fun, especially for the player. And like, I don't want to say you could just feel the ill will, but listen, it was one of those things that I don't think is fun for anyone, and there's a bit of a hangover.
I believe.
How do you think that affects at all what this situation is right now, knowing that if they don't get a deal done, it is arbitration again, even though at the end of that situation, you're going to be a UFA?
Well, I agree with you that it's a painful conversation. And I remember he called it war. He like the specific ruling. And even a guy like him who really does understand the business side of the game really well would not be immune to the emotions of it, right? Like I'm gonna completely butcher an old Paul Maurice quote about when they hire a new coach and fire a coach or whatever, but I'm gonna change it. It's, for me, arbitration is like the partner's telling you you're a lousy lover. Here are all the reasons we fought. Here's everything I don't like about you. There are other better people than you. By the way, let's keep the marriage going. Right? Like that is awkward to go through, and then commit to another 2 years and then re-up again. So I mean, like I can't imagine that Andrew Copp is sitting there being like, yes, please arbitration, but it's a tool available to him, and certainly knowing that there's only a 1-year deal available through it gives him a hammer. It gives him a hammer if the long-term negotiations aren't going the way that they particularly want. And even if he elects for it, I should also say this because this always comes up in these discussions, he can elect for it. The date will get set out a few weeks from August 1st is the deadline to choose to file for it. They can continue to negotiate right up until that hearing. And so that if we see him elect for it, we also know that they're going to continue to work on it. Pardon me.
Murat, do the Jets need to know on Andrew Copp before the expansion draft? And I guess part two to that question is if Larry Simmons and Cheveldayoff are having talks with Overhart, and it seems like this is really going to be tough to get him done on any sort of term here in Winnipeg, how does that affect their decisions going into the Seattle draft?
I think it does. I don't think it's a situation to panic over for them. I mean, there's a lot of arguments that say the easiest thing a team could do is just protect your guys, understand that you're going to lose Mason Appleton or Logan Stanley or Dylan DeMello and just move on with time and accept it. But I'm pretty sure the Jets would ideally not like to do that. And if they don't believe that they can get Andrew Copp signed long term, well, then you want to try to get something back for him as soon as possible. And I look at that in that piece, and I talk about the sorts of futures. Winnipeg doesn't have as deep of a pipeline anymore. They have 4 picks in this draft. They've only had 16 over the last 3. They should have had 21 if they'd held on to everything. So they're at a stage in their development where they could genuinely use a recoup of trade assets, especially if they don't believe they're going to sign the guy long term. And like you mentioned, the expansion draft. If you know he's gone, and you can make that trade now, then it's easy to protect Mason Appleton. You're not losing him for nothing as well as knowing that Copp would leave. You can recoup some futures. Maybe you use a pick to protect both DeMello and Logan Stanley. Like, it would solve a lot of headaches, and is something that Winnipeg should absolutely be exploring with Overhart, exploring with the trade market as well. They need this information just in case. And then if it doesn't come their way, then they need that information to choose what path they take with it.
Yeah, and because I'm along that same line of thinking, and that's why I believe. I mean, I would be shocked if they weren't already having discussions and, try to feeling each other out as far as what's there. Because listen, I mean, if Copp wants to sign here, he's been a part of the growth of this hockey club. He's a very important member of the team. If he does want to continue through that, I really do think that there's a deal to be made. But as you mentioned, I mean, if there's not a deal to be made, Andrew Copp is not the sort of a player I think the Winnipeg Jets would be comfortable with playing on an expiring deal and just losing him at the end of the year for nothing. He's too important. And if that's the case, especially when you consider what's happening with Seattle, some of the other spots around the league, there certainly could be a move maybe where Copp is dealt before the expansion draft, because there's many teams, and you mentioned a couple of them in the piece, where Andrew Copp walks in and isn't just a protected player, but one of their more important players up front. And I think that probably helps him as far as getting what he feels is, his value on a long-term contract, but also for the Winnipeg Jets would avoid losing Copp for nothing and going through another uncomfortable arbitration hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I begin to think about on that front, because Seattle has a lot of cards, and certainly we have an NHL-wide trade freeze coming up, but that doesn't apply to Seattle. I wonder, because you look at the relative lack of top forward quality available in the expansion draft, there are good players, but Mason Appleton for me is a second line player on the, if you look at all the protection lists I see at least, he's one of the better forwards available, and there's a lot of good defensemen. So there's a possibility that Seattle runs the table, that fantasy drafter who picks 8 goalies in the first round and trades them all. We've all played with that person. If they make a run on defense, could there be some sort of deal in place where Andrew Copp gets moved, not as part of the draft, but as part of draft considerations to Seattle specifically for one of their excess defensemen as well? And I mean, that may be palatable to Jets fans in a post-expansion draft scenario, because then it's not Andrew Copp for 2 second-round picks, and who knows if one of those is going to become nearly as good as Andrew Copp. Whereas Winnipeg's clear needs are on defense as well. There's lots of different permutations, and I think that this fixed deadline of Seattle expansion is going to be a motivation for teams to solve those problems. And if not by then, well, then soon after. I think this is going to be an intense window.
Yeah, it's a great point. And again, we won't know 100% until the weekend when the expansion draft lists are finalized. But if there is a real scarcity of talented forwards available for Seattle, I think the idea of, acquiring Andrew Copp and having him be one of the key players going forward and signing him to a deal for the Seattle Kraken would certainly be something that would be in the cards. Now, does Copp want to go and, I think it would be really exciting to be there in the first year, but I don't know whether you're really contending for a Stanley Cup anytime soon, despite what Vegas did before. So there's so much that goes into this, both for the player and the team. But from a Winnipeg perspective, if a deal's not getting done and they know they've got him for 1 year or trade him, I think your point's very well taken in that he would be an attractive asset for a team like Seattle to have, or Seattle to move elsewhere if they don't think he fits in. And certainly there will be defensemen exposed by other teams that I think would have interest from Winnipeg Jets front office staff and Kevin Cheveldayoff to come in and, help fortify the blue line, which of course has been the big topic of conversation really from the second that Dustin Byfuglien walked out the door.
Yeah, that's the chief issue, right? Where we're at in the story of the Winnipeg Jets is we know their forwards can hang. We know their goaltender is exceptional. There's a clear problem. And the question is, how do they address it? Traditionally, that would be draft and develop. And if they don't believe that Ville Heinola and Dylan Samberg and Logan Stanley are there yet, and I think that that's a lot of pressure on young players and rookies to just be the answer without any moves aside from them. Well, then they need answers from somehow outside the organization. Are they going to be David Savard's first choice? Are they going to be Jamie Oleksiak's first choice? Do they have a play at Dougie Hamilton? I don't necessarily think so. So the question becomes, how can they best use their shrewd negotiations or trade situations or follow through from Seattle's perspective or whatever it's going to be, and read other situations in an attempt to sort of poach defensemen. I think that's when you're the Winnipeg Jets, I think that's an area that you always have to be exploring.
And now, Murat, we've got about just over a week really before the expansion draft. It's hard to believe how this is all coming so quickly. Expansion draft on the Wednesday, draft on the Friday, free agency the following Wednesday. But, as we get closer to this date, and again, we're going to find out this list on Saturday or on the weekend as to what every team is doing. I think, we've talked about this plenty. I think the Jets would be loath to lose Logan Stanley. And I think the same could be said for Dylan DeMello with how important he is to the Jet blue line. Let's just assume that Copp's situation is still unresolved and he's one of the 7 protected forwards. Appleton would be probably the top forward available, and then you'd have the 2 defensemen. How do you see this playing out? Do they give up an asset to avoid losing one of those 3 players? Or if, regardless of those 2, is Mason Appleton the most attractive player to an expansion team in your mind?
Well, for me, I do think that. I think Mason Appleton is so disproportionately attractive as an asset that, like, all of the debates we're having, and I don't want to undercut them because it's so compelling. And I definitely have opinions on Stanley versus DeMello and each player's unique spot in development right now. But if you're looking at Mason Appleton, $900K, restricted free agent, years of team control left, to me, that's like a guarantee that he's going to outperform that contract, right? We saw him take a step forward this year. He has unique abilities on the Winnipeg Jets in that he'll turn the corner on people, drive the net. There's certain assets that I think that, if I'm Winnipeg, certainly I'd like to hold on to that player, but I think he's the most attractive of the assets because at $900K, you have a player who maybe you can pigeonhole him into a second line, definitely a third line ability, and he can play a few different ways. So I think that that's an attractive asset. I think Logan Stanley is still a bit new to the NHL, and I know that it's so tempting to project. Look where he came from. The AHL looked good in the NHL, 6'7", sky's the limit, where's he going? But I, in a recent mailbag, went through every player with his resume over the last however many years. And like the high watermark for that is Jamie Oleksiak, who is a player that's maybe going to stay in Dallas, maybe not. A player who took some time to evolve into a really strong top 4 player after years of third pairing success. And Logan Stanley's third pairing success is so real and so worth celebrating, but also there's the idea that he was sheltered. Dylan DeMello, certainly not going to stun you with his size, with his explosive hits or anything like that. He's not going to light it up points-wise either, so I can understand why he's not as shiny to a lot of folks, but he also just signed a 4-year deal. And, if you're the Winnipeg Jets looking to offer stability to people who signed with you, the idea of just letting him go for nothing seems a little bit awkward, sort of optics-wise to me as well. So I think they really want to keep both players, but might not have to jump through as many hoops to do so as maybe we've imagined.
Murat of The Athletic with us, talking Andrew Copp, Jets situation heading into the expansion draft. I imagine you'll have a piece or 2 before next week on these very topics. What do you got coming up for the readers in The Athletic, Murat?
Well, I want to talk about trade options on defense and whether that involves Seattle as a broker. I guess I've mentioned it a couple of times. It's front of mind right now because I think that if you look at what Seattle can do running the table, they're going to end up with assets for trade. And if Winnipeg's proactive about that, that might be a route where Winnipeg gets the defense, that defensive help that it needs. Certainly the UFA targets are out there and we can discuss them as well. Trades will be an issue. That Andrew Copp scenario is front of mind because I think he has unique power. But what about Neil Pionk as well, right? Multiple seasons of strength, point production, power play point production, argument that he's played better than Josh Morrissey in his 2 seasons as well. He needs a new contract, so that's going to be compelling as well. I guess there's no shortage. It's going to be just a packed next couple of weeks here.
Hey, one other question, and I can't even believe I'm asking this because of how crazy this last year has been and what really was the thoughts when this young man was selected. But Cole Perfetti had just, he benefited as much from the pandemic maybe as anyone. Playing in the American Hockey League, getting to go to the World Championships. We saw what he did with the Moose. How is Perfetti's situation? How does that affect at all what the Winnipeg Jets are doing when we talk about a player like Copp or losing an Appleton? I can't see him going back to junior next year. But again, the only other option is playing in the National Hockey League. What do you make of Perfetti's situation and how, if at all, that might affect the thinking of Winnipeg Jets brass when it comes to these tough decisions over the next few weeks?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my perspective assumes that the NHL is not going to work out some kind of 11th hour arrangement to allow these teenagers to play in the AHL. So, if it's NHL or OHL, which this is the expectation, then he's in exactly I don't want to call it an awkward spot. It's a great spot to be in. I mean, not only having a successful run at the World Junior Championships, turning 19 on January 1st, having a year in the AHL that for me, in terms of development, was perfectly paced, because you have the first half where he's really making hay with the man advantage in overtime situations whenever there's time and space. But as the season goes on, and the question we ask about Cole Perfetti is, can he produce against men with size and speed and veteran experience? Well, he started to do it at 5-on-5 too towards the end of that season. And now you get a little bit excited about that player. And so for me, it becomes about Winnipeg, and are they willing to play a teenage Cole Perfetti in somewhat of a sheltered 5-on-5 role, whether that means just him and two great veteran forwards or him a little bit lower down in the lineup, give power play time. It's been a while since we've seen that trick from the Winnipeg Jets, I think. And they've reserved it traditionally for these really high-end Patrick Laine's, Nick Ehlers, Kyle Connor sort of situations as well. Mark Scheifele went back to junior multiple times. So it, to me, seems like Winnipeg should look at this. Absolutely, they should. The AHL is such a phenomenal developmental place for not just him, but maybe Byfield, Zigra, so many others. Zach Parise, back in the 2003 draft, runs into the NHL lockout 2004, 2005. So many players, teenagers, played in the AHL. We look back at the 2003 draft as one of the best that ever happened. Well, one of those reasons might be we had teenagers playing against men in this perfect developmental league. Cole Perfetti did a good thing, got good results, and now he's in a really good situation. I think there's a real chance he plays.
Well, so do I. And again, with his size and where he was selected, I think the plan originally was a couple years down. But then I kind of go back and think about the way this team has handled some other top prospects, and I can't help but compare him to Nikolai Ehlers. I mean, Ehlers was the 9th overall pick in 2014. Perfetti was the 10th overall pick. Ehlers went back to junior for a year and had a very strong year playing junior, and then went right to the National Hockey League and played 72 games for the Jets next year. But he had 15 goals and 38 points. I mean, I think I could make the argument that the year that Perfetti had last year, playing in the American Hockey League and the World Juniors and the World Championships and all that, would do way more to prepare him to be ready for the National Hockey League than Nikolai Ehlers going back for that other year of junior. And when you kind of think about that with the situation that the team is in, especially knowing what the alternative is, I think to me that points that he'll have every opportunity to show that he can stick with the club.
I think so. I think that this is a very real situation where he'll arrive prepared. I've heard that he's working out pretty hard, has cut some of the baby fat away, has a bit of extra hop in his step. Of course, we always hear these things during the summertime as well. But I think that he's doing everything in his power to earn that shot. I think he'll get it. And I think that it'll be worth looking back at the minutes treatment that Ehlers got. Because when I think of young player bursting into the NHL recently for the Winnipeg Jets, I think of Kyle Connor, and you have Blake Wheeler and Mark Scheifele being like, okay, he's our guy. And that's a rare thing. I don't think that's realistic to expect for Cole Perfetti in his first full NHL season. So where are these other examples? How did Paul Maurice integrate these young guys and get the most out of them in a developmental context for forwards in the past? Because that's the blueprint probably for Cole Perfetti. And I think, like we say, that's going to be an exciting story at camp, because he'll make it look like he should play, and we'll probably see him get into a couple of games.
Yeah, BA says Cole will be on the Moose. This is the reason why we're having this conversation, BA, that under the current rules, Cole Perfetti can't play on the Moose next year. The only reason he was able to play last year is that the Ontario Hockey League wasn't playing. It was a very unique situation that he was able to come in as an 18-year-old drafted player and play in the American Hockey League. And that's something that the CHL and the National Hockey League have talked about for years, whether they would be an exception per team. As of right now, that's not the case. And as Murat mentioned, unless something changes, this is the framework that the Winnipeg Jets are going to have to deal with going into training camp. It's either an NHL job or back to junior. And you wonder, after everything he did last year, how beneficial that would be for his development. Murat, always great having you on the program, my friend. We'll look forward to doing it soon. Going to be a really exciting few weeks for hockey fans, especially ones in Winnipeg. Looking forward to seeing how the blue line in particular, but also the roster gets shuffled as we go into an expansion draft, free agency, and of course, the draft as well. Always great chopping it up with you, my man.
Right on. Yeah, thanks for having me. Loved it.
Talk to you soon. There he is, Murat Atesh. Follow him on Twitter at WPG Murat and check out all of his great work in the pages of The Athletic. Always great having Murat on. And we'll definitely have, we'll hopefully, in and around draft, expansion draft, going into free agency, hopefully get our pal Murat back on. But if you're not already subscribing to The Athletic, he does such a great work. And the piece I tweeted out today on Andrew Copp's situation, very, very interesting. If you're a Jet fan, you should probably be subbed and checking out Murat's work on a daily basis.